From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Before we start, let me make an announcement. I'm John Cole from the Library of Congress, but I wanted to say that we are videotaping this for the library's collections, and we hope to have a brief question and answer period at the end, and we'd invite you to participate. And if you decide to participate, we take your decision as your permission to have you as part of our videotape. But I'm happy to say that if you look at the Center for the Book's website, we do have talks such as this, over around 70 or 80 of the talks over the last 4 or 5 years. So this is an important part of our activity. Well, good afternoon. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, and I would like to welcome you to another in our series of Books and Beyond author talks. Center for the Book was created in 1977 to stimulate public interest in books and reading. We do it in many ways through networks across the country of state centers, with reading promotion partners, and through activities such as the National Book Festival, where we play an important role, but also, more directly, in events such as this. The Books and Beyond series consists of talks by authors about books that have a special relationship to the Library of Congress, sometimes based on our collections, other times directly related to a project of the Library of Congress. Today's talk, I would like to tell you, is a partnership endeavor, as are all of our talks. Both the Manuscript Division of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian Institution Libraries are partners. I'd like to thank Len Bruno, who is a specialist in science and technology from the Manuscript Division, for suggesting we have Tom Crouch here today. And I'd like to thank Nancy Gwynn, the director of the Smithsonian Libraries, for her co-sponsorship, and Bob Kearns, who's seated next to her, for helping spread the word about this talk and bringing in a good audience for Tom Crouch. Nancy, would you like to stand up so people know who you are? Tom will tell you a little bit about the resources that he's used for this talk. I should say that it is their Manuscript Division resources, and that will be part of his presentation. And he also will briefly outline the topic, so I'm going to say a word about Tom. He is the Senior Curator of the Division of Aeronautics at the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum. I've learned to say NASM. I think that's right. Since 1974, he has served both NASM and the National Museum of American History in a variety of curatorial and administrative posts. He holds a PhD in American History from Ohio State University, an honorary degree in Doctor of Humane Letters from Wright State University, and Tom has won several major writing awards. He's really an excellent writer. In the fall of 2000, President Clinton appointed him chairman of the First Flight Centennial Federal Advisory Board. You can ask him about that in the questions and answer period. Tom is the author or editor of more than a dozen books and many articles for both magazines and scholarly journals. His leading books include The Bishop's Boys, A Life of Wilbur and Orville Wright, published in 1989, Dream of Wings, America and the Airplane, 1875 to 1905, published in 1981, Eagle Aloft, 2 Centuries of the Balloon in America, 1983, and Wings, A History of Aviation from Kites to the Space Age, 2003. All excellent books with great titles. It's my pleasure now to present Tom Crouch. Tom?
Thanks, John, and thanks to all of you for coming out on what's a really great day. I'm not sure I would have come in to listen to a talk today. It's so great outside, but I appreciate your having done so. When it comes to Washington scholarly institutions, I've always been convinced that most historians fall into one of two camps. There are people who prefer to research at the National Archive, and there are people who prefer to research at the Library of Congress. Well, of course, all of us do research in both institutions, but I'm still convinced that that preference is there. And mine certainly has always been for the Library of Congress. It was almost 40 years ago when I first walked through the door, and there's at least one person here who was there when I first came to the library. Over the years, as John suggested, I've turned out a string of books based on collections, mostly in the manuscript division, but obviously I've used lots of divisions of the library. I've drawn heavily from the papers of Wilbur and Orville Wright, the papers of Octave Chanute, the Tissandier papers, the von Braun papers, the Picard papers, even the papers of Robert Frost. Most people don't realize that Frost actually, as a teenager, visited an isolated little fishing village on the Outer Banks called Kitty Hawk a year before the Wright brothers arrived, and half a century later wrote what a lot of authorities regard as his finest poem about that visit. So I'm really familiar with the manuscript division. John's right about that. There's one collection in the manuscript division with which I do have a special relationship. When you walk into the reading room on the far side, you see all the cabinets where the finding aids are. And there is one finding aid for something called the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics History Collection. And it's really a fascinating collection, the AIAA History Collection. It contains virtually all of the Thaddeus Lowe papers, the Civil War balloonists, that aren't in the National Archive, and the papers of other early birds, scrapbooks containing clippings on the history of American ballooning going back to the late 18th century and running all the way through the 19th century. My book, Eagle Aloft, those scrapbooks from the AIAA History Collection were basically the spine of that book. And a huge number of files on aviators through the 1950s and 60s, and on corporations too, aviation corporations. It's a great source of information, annual reports, and press releases, economic stuff on a variety of aircraft manufacturers, airlines, so on and so forth. If you turn to the last 2 pages of the finding aid for the AIAA History Collection, you'll see a little article that I published in 1981 on the history, the foundation of the earliest predecessor organization of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, the Institute of Aeronautical Sciences. Someone, when I was working with the collection last year, a younger staff member from the manuscript division came up to me in the reading room with the finding aid in hand and asked if I was really what had become of that slim guy with all the hair whose photograph was on the last page of that article. That article was published in celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Institute of Aeronautical Sciences, the AIAA. And 25 years later, I finally went beyond that article to write a history of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics and the predecessor organizations. It's called Rocketeers and Gentlemen Engineers, as you can see. Actually, it has the longest title of any book I've ever written. And I wasn't really crazy about the title, but I guess it does tell you something about the subject of the book. I've been fascinated by the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics for a very long time, for a whole raft of reasons. Having used the collection downstairs all those years, I was always curious as to why in the world a professional technical society, I should say that today the AIAA is the largest professional society for scientists and engineers involved in the aerospace industry, in the world, really. It's hard to think of an American scientist or engineer involved in aeronautics who hasn't been a member of AIAA or one of its two predecessor organizations, the Institute of the Aeronautical Sciences on the air side, or the American Rocket Society on the astronautical side. So why in the world do these guys, who are members of an organization that looks straight into the future, the guys who really are cutting-edge scientists and engineers, why would they at one point in the history of their organization been so fascinated with the history of flight technology that they built what was probably, after the Library of Congress and perhaps the Smithsonian in the 1940s, the finest aeronautical archive in the United States? Why would they do that? But going beyond that, AIAA has always fascinated me for another reason, because it is the professional society for aerospace engineers and scientists. And I'm absolutely convinced that professionalization is a really important topic for historians to pay attention to. The moment when a professional, an occupational group professionalizes is just incredibly important. A professional society enables a group, an occupational group, to define themselves. Just who are we as doctors or lawyers or engineers or whatever the society is? It enables the members of the group to sort of control entry into their ranks. It provides an outlet for research and a check on the quality of research. It's a means of facilitating communication between members of the profession. And these days, it allows the profession to speak with one voice to the rest of society. And if you doubt the importance of professional societies, I would just suggest that you take a look at the American Medical Association or the American Bar Association. AIAA is that for aerospace science and technology. Engineers began professionalizing in the late 18th century. Actually, the first English speakers who actually referred to themselves as engineers, from the French, of course, formed the first societies, beginning with the Society of Civil Engineers in England in 1771 and running through the other societies, down to the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, which was founded in London in 1848. And American engineers followed suit only slightly later. The American Society of Civil Engineers in 1852, the mining engineers in 1871, the mechanicals in 1880, electricals in 1884, chemical engineers in 1908, and so on. It's fascinating to recognize that when it comes to flight, engineers were really professionally fascinated by the subject of winged flight at a time when it was a subject, most people just regarded it as errant nonsense. Even scientists, engineers were fascinated by it. The very first presidential lecture given to members of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers by Robert Henry Thurston in 1880 was on the subject not of machine design or anything of that sort. It was on flight. The very first ASME presidential lecture was on flight. On the other side of the house, among civil engineers, Octave Chanute, whose papers, of course, are here, was not only a leading professional engineer, president of the American Society of Civil Engineers, the Western Society of Engineers. He was president of the engineering section of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, but he was also sort of the most ardent believer in winged flight in this country in the late 19th century. He insisted on sessions on flying machines at professional engineering meetings, lectured on the subject at colleges, published widely on the subject, and of course became involved in the work of all sorts of young men who were actually taking the final steps toward the invention of the airplane, including Wilbur and Orville Wright. So the interest of professional engineers in flight goes way, way back. One of the interesting things about the aeronautical engineers is that they faced a couple of problems that most engineers didn't face when it came to professionalization. They had an image problem. Aeronautical engineers, and I'm not sure why this is the case, but right down to today, if you think of engineers as they're presented in films like Ron Howard's Apollo 13, for example, you know, they're nerdy guys with pocket protectors and slide rules in the old days and that kind of thing. And that's always been the image. As the editor of Flight, which was the leading English language journal of record in the field, explained to his readers in January of 1909, quote, "The men who design and build airplanes deserve a degree of credit for their work which is far higher than the uninitiated are apt to accord them. But at the same time, their names, of course, must always stand second to those intrepid pioneers who actually practice the art of flight. The pilots, in other words. Now, the pilots aren't going to have anything to fly if it's not for the scientists and engineers. But again, the sort of pride of place in the public mind has always gone to the folks with the right stuff, the men and women who fly airplanes, as opposed to the men and women who actually build them. Another problem that was sort of unique to aeronautics was the fact that other groups of engineers had been able to sort of organize by their professional interests: mechanical engineers, civil engineers, electrical engineers, chemical engineers. But when it came to aeronautics, you were dealing with a field that needed all of those specialties, as well as meteorologists and aerospace medical experts and physicists, a whole raft of technical and scientific professionals. So defining a society for aeronautical engineering specialists was a little tougher than in some other fields. And the other thing was, of course, that aeronautics was a relatively small field until you get into the 1930s. There had been attempts to organize aeronautical engineers quite early on in the first decade of the century. And to some extent, there had been some success. Even today, the Society of Automotive Engineers and the American Society of Mechanical Engineers have sections relating to aeronautical engineers. Lots of propulsion specialists in the field belong to SAE, for example, or ASME. The Society of Automotive Engineers actually tried to organize the aeronautical professionals and had a very difficult time of it. So it's really not until 1928 that the first serious attempt to organize takes place. And it takes a couple of years, 1928 to 1932, essentially. And there were two individuals who were most heavily involved in organizing the Institute of the Aerospace, what became the aerospace, originally the aeronautical sciences. One of the organizers was a fellow named Jerome Hunsaker. Jerry Hunsaker essentially founded aeronautical engineering in the United States. He created the first graduate program in aeronautical engineering at MIT in 1913 and remained a leader in the field until the time of his death, long after World War II. The other guy was even more interesting. His name was Lester Duran Gardner. And Lester Gardner's papers are actually part of the AIAA history collection downstairs. He was a real character. He was an MIT grad, but he was always much more comfortable as a businessman and a publicist than he was as an engineer. He founded a whole string of businesses. He founded Aviation magazine, which is now Aviation and Space Week, sort of the Bible of the aerospace industry in this country today. Was one of the founders of the Aeronautical Chamber of Commerce, And by the late 1920s, he'd become convinced that aeronautics in this country needed a sort of social headquarters. He said, you know, when we go to England or France or Germany, they all have sort of aeronautical engineering clubs to which we can go. The Royal Aeronautical Society, for example, in London with a lovely clubhouse, and we can go and have dinner and meet colleagues. And we don't have anything like that in this country. And we really need something like that. And he went to Hunsaker, originally in 1928, trying to talk Hunsaker into buying into this notion. Jerry Hunsaker's notion of a society for aeronautical scientists and engineers was quite different. He envisioned something much more like a traditional professional society. And when AIAA, or the Institute of Aeronautical Sciences, IAS originally, was finally organized in 1932, it was kind of a cross between those two visions. It did many of the things that a professional society does. They published, and in fact, they took extraordinary care in terms of the quality of their publications. The very first issue of the IAS journal included articles by world leaders in the field. Theodor von Karman, who was then emerging as the leading aerodynamicist in this country, and certainly one of them in the world. Other articles by the leading meteorologist, and John Stack, an aerodynamicist with the NACA, and just the very best people in the field. On that side of things, the people who founded the Institute, the IAS, were really trying to establish a level of quality in the profession. The Royal Aeronautical Society was their model. And what the Royal Aeronautical Society did was even administer a series of tests that the English government gave to individuals who wanted to enter the engineering profession. And you took tests at a particular grade, and you were licensed that way. The IAS even had a vision of doing that sort of thing in this country. They were extraordinarily elitist. There really isn't any other way to describe them. They had a vision of themselves as the real creme de la creme of the field. And over the years, gradually, they would invite engineers who were sort of coming of age to join this group of leaders that they envisioned as the IAS. They had fairly stringent rules. No women, for example. They actually sat down in a meeting and decided that there would be no women members in the IAS. There was a pilot category of members, and not too surprisingly, somebody had suggested Amelia Earhart as a member. They actually discussed it and said, no women. And so it's not until just before World War II that an engineer at Wright Field, who was editing the Wright Field technical reports, became finally the first woman member of the Institute of Aeronautical Sciences. As I said, Lester Gardner, who was really at the heart of the IAS, envisioned something that was more than a professional society. He really wanted an organization that would be a meeting place for aeronautical engineers. He really wanted a clubhouse, just like the one the Royal Aeronautical Society had. And there were similar organizations in France and Britain that had lovely clubhouses and so on and so forth. And that's what Lester Gardner wanted. And he got it. The Sky Room of Rockefeller Center, which was brand new then. They talked Nelson Rockefeller, who was in charge of renting out office space in the new Rockefeller Center, into giving the IAS office space in the hope that they would attract aeronautical corporations into renting space in Rock Center. And they fitted out those offices at the Sky Room beginning in 1933 in just the finest fashion. Great furniture, wall decorations, all of that kind of thing. So he envisioned the IAS as a sort of meeting place, but as a cultural organization too. He was fascinated by history, and almost from the beginning, he began to build a library. They be able to loan hard-to-find books on aeronautical engineering to members all over the country. But not satisfied with that, he began to build an indexing operation, just as professional librarians do it today. With WPA money, Gardner at IAS set up an indexing project that ultimately employed literally over 100 people, going through aeronautical journals and books, going all the way back and coming all the way up into the years of the Great Depression, and indexing articles and that kind of thing. And in fact, that was a business that the organization was going to remain in until actually just a very few years ago. They were still doing technical abstracting. And once he had the indexing operation going, he started a collecting operation. He began in the late 1930s collecting rare aeronautica, beginning with some Wright brothers materials that an old acquaintance of the Wright brothers donated, and eventually building by borrowing new collections and again paying his indexers to go to libraries all over the country searching for newspaper articles and magazine articles, rare aeronautica and that kind of thing. That's where all those scrapbooks downstairs come from. And ultimately, not satisfied with that, he began to build a museum collection. He would ask IAS members to donate mementos, models, whatever. He got Orville Wright, who was the first honorary member of the IAS, involved and donated pieces of fabric from the original airplane and so on and so forth. And before you knew it, the original building, the original rooms in Rockefeller Center, the IAS had outgrown them. They had to move 3 times before World War II into ever larger quarters to house this growing collection of theirs. So by the time World War II came along, they were actually spending more time on those sorts of library-related cultural activities as they were on the normal sorts of professional service activities that you expect of a technical society. So that's the Institute of the Aeronautical Sciences. That's half of these organizations that come to form the AIAA in 1963. The other half was the American Rocket Society. And I mean, if you can imagine these elitist IAS guys standing on their heads, that's the American Rocket Society. The ARS was founded by 12 science fiction writers in a speakeasy in Greenwich Village in 1930. The real founder was a fellow named Gawain Edward Pendray, Ed Pendray, and his wife Lee. Unlike the IAS, women were a part of the American Rocket Society from the get-go. When you look at the 12 people who founded the ARS, they were really fairly wild-eyed, off-the-wall types. Writers, publicists, a couple of professional technical types, but they were really very thin on professional expertise. The original president, and with Ed Pendray, the founder of the ARS, was a guy named David Lasser, who was essentially a 20th century utopian socialist. He was an MIT grad, but he discovered, like Lester Gardner, I guess, that he preferred writing and the publication business to actually doing engineering. And so Lasser had gone to work for a guy named Hugo Gernsback, who was actually the founder of pulp science fiction in this country. Hugo Gernsback was quite a character and founded a magazine called Amazing Stories in 1928, which was the first real modern science fiction pulp magazine, and David Lasser was the editor. Lasser was, as I said, a real utopian dreamer. He didn't last real long with Hugo Gernsback. Gernsback, one day in 1931, saw a picture in the New York Times of David Lasser leading a labor protest in New York. And he became so incensed that he called Lasser into the office and he said, you know, if you're so fond of hanging out with those characters, you can go do it full time. And Lasser left Gernsback's employ and he founded, if you can imagine it, what must have been the world's first labor union for the unemployed. It was really an extraordinary organization. And he got into trouble, as so many folks did in the 1930s and 40s, being identified as a left-wing politico and so on and so forth, and ultimately was able to clear his name. In 1981, when the AIAA was celebrating its 25th anniversary, Lesser was still living. And they invited him to come out to California and be part of the celebration and give a talk. And son of a gun, if he didn't give this sort of utopian vision of space flight that he had in the beginning of, you know, when spaceships go into orbit, they won't carry national flags, they'll carry all humanity. And I mean, it was just like someone at the podium in a working man's hall in the 1930s. Just a wonderful, wonderfully colorful character, as all of these guys were. Originally, the members of the ARS wanted to publicize the dream of space flight. As Pendray once said, they thought if they talked this notion of travel beyond the atmosphere up, it would catch fire and everybody would agree that it was the thing to do and off they'd go. And well, that didn't happen. They grew very slowly. They were really a fringe organization initially. In 1931, Ed and Lee Pendray, his wife, went to Germany on a visit. And in Berlin, they met the members of the Verein für Raumschifffahrt, the German Spaceflight Society, of which the young Werner von Braun was already a member. And these guys, far from just trying to publicize space flight, were actually building and launching liquid propellant rockets. And Pendray just caught fire. He came back to this country. And at the very first meeting of the ARS that he attended after he returned, he said, you know, we got to retread this organization. Heck with this publicizing the dream business. Let's go out and realize it. And within a year of its foundation, the American Rocket Society was transformed from sort of a space interest group and booster society to a society of amateur rocket builders. From 1931 into World War II, the early World War II years, that is what they did. They built and launched rockets. Ultimately, by the mid-30s, they become convinced that it's really counterproductive to fire these rockets a few hundred feet into the air. And they decide to focus on developing rocket motors. And so most of their really important work in the 1930s doesn't result in rockets flying into the air at all. They're running rocket motors on test stands and trying to improve their characteristics. And by 1941, the members of the American Rocket Society have a regeneratively cooled rocket motor. That's a motor in which the propellant is circulated around the combustion chamber to cool the chamber and preheat the propellant for a more efficient burning. And that engine, motor, becomes the original product of the first American company that's founded to build rocket motors, Reaction Motors, Inc. And that company, along with the Aerojet General Company in Philadelphia, which was founded by a similar group of academic amateurs from Caltech, become the first two American rocket building companies. That necessitates another transition, really, in the history of the American Rocket Society. By the time World War II is over, what the members of the ARS had been doing before the war was no longer required. Rocket building had become a big business. The Germans had built V-2s, which were capable of delivering 1 metric ton of TNT into the heart of London, having been fired from Belgium and Holland, and so on and so forth. The ballistic missile had arrived, and lots of smaller rocket packages, from jet-assisted takeoff rockets to get heavily laden airplanes into the air, to air-launched rocket-propelled weapons and ground-launched anti-aircraft rockets. Rocket building had become a business. There was no longer a need for the kind of amateur rocket builders that the members of the American Rocket Society had been before the war. And so for the second time, they redefined themselves. The ARS decided that it would become no longer amateur rocket builders. They would become a professional engineering society for technicians who were entering this brand new field of rocket and jet propulsion. I guess my favorite chapters in the book have to do with the American Rocket Society in the 1940s and 50s, when they're kind of struggling to redefine themselves. The rocket industry was new then and sort of shaky, and engineers and industrial leaders who were involved in it were very closely tied to their customers, to the American military, and so on. And they became really frightened that if they spent a lot of time talking about space flight and this future visionary stuff in which the ARS was rooted, they were going to look like, complete dreamers and fools, and the government was going to stop spending money on their products. The government was going to begin to doubt their sanity, even. And so within the American Rocket Society in the 1940s, there's really sort of an anti-space flight movement. All sorts of letters from industrial leaders who are financing the ARS, who are saying to members of the organization, this von Braun stuff, as they always called it, having, space flight and space stations and going to the moon and Mars and so on. This is just frightening stuff, and it's driving away customers, and by golly, we can't get rockets off the pad yet. We better focus on what we're doing right now and leave the future stuff to the future. At the same time, there was a little coterie of ARS members who believed that exactly the opposite was true, that you had to work for the dream of space flight, and now was the time to do it, and there was lots of room for theoretical studies. And so you had this really interesting tension in the American Rocket Society that turned it into just an extraordinarily interesting organization during the 1950s. That tension is at its peak between 1950 and 1957, when just before Sputnik is launched, a year before Sputnik is launched, the ARS plays an important role in convincing the American government to pursue a satellite project as an American contribution to the International Geophysical Year. And they actually, two teams of satellite projects come out of the American Rocket Society. The Vanguard project, headed by Milt Rosen, and the Explorer project, headed by Wernher von Braun and others. So the American Rocket Society, by 1957, has grown beyond the old tension to become a really interesting organization that's on the front page of American magazines and newspapers, and they're holding huge public meetings. The Spaceflight Report to the Nation, they rented the entire New York Coliseum in 1960 and invited all kinds of exhibitors to do spaceflight kinds of things, and leaders in the field from all over the world came in to give lectures. Vice President Johnson came. They were really making headlines. At the same time, turning back to the Institute of Aeronautical Sciences, those guys were facing hard times now. Not financial hard times. From the beginning of World War II through the early post-war years, the Institute of the Aeronautical Sciences built an incredibly large endowment, mostly money coming in from aeronautical industrial leaders. So they were really on a very solid footing. They were building a headquarters building or they bought a headquarters building in New York and built buildings in Los Angeles and San Diego. And so they were a solid professional society. Unlike the people in the American Rocket Society, they refused to do exhibitions at their annual meetings or anything of that sort. They still regarded themselves as elite and professional and all of that kind of thing. But if you look at membership figures for the Institute of the Aeronautical Sciences and the ARS in the 1950s, you can just see them crossing like this. The American Rocket Society is on its way up, and the IAS is sinking. When I was working on the book, I went through Institute of the Aeronautical Sciences, now Aerospace Sciences, publications. And before 1956, all of the covers on the popular magazine published by the IAS, for example, are distinctly aeronautical. After 1956, they relate to spaceflight. You can look at the ads. Again, after the mid-1950s, the ads all focus on the future as space flight, articles in the journals, all of that kind of thing. And so these two organizations that had begun in such different ways were really on a collision course. Industry types and the military types too came to recognize that they couldn't afford to support two professional societies that were doing things that were so similar. You have to recognize that when it comes to professional societies like AIAA, the members often aren't paying their own expenses. Membership fees, attendance at meetings, and that kind of thing, that often comes from the employer. So industry had a real investment in these organizations. And to make a long story short, in the early 1960s, they forced a merger between the Institute of the Aeronautical Sciences and the American Rocket Society. When you talk to AIAA members today, old-timers, they will almost invariably be able to tell you whether they're IAS types or ARS types. They really, there were distinct cultural differences between the two organizations, and to some extent, they're still there today. I've only taken you actually to the foundation of the AIAA, and the book, of course, brings the organization all the way down to today. And many interesting things have happened since the 1960s. But I'm going to stop here, and if you're interested, take a look. Just in closing, I mean, I always do this. Thank organizations like the Library of Congress that have enabled me to locate information all these years, and Smithsonian libraries as well. And people like Lynn Bruno and Nancy Gwynn from those organizations, and the people from my own NASM library over the years. And just in closing, I just noticed this morning and decided that I especially wanted to thank John Gunny Matlock, who did a really great reader's review for the book on Amazon that I saw for the first time this morning. So I'll stop with that and see if there are any questions. Any questions? Or questions about other things? About somebody had a Wright Brothers question. What was it about Catherine?
I'm always, interested in, how relatively little attention she's had at, obviously, with her brothers. But I guess one question, because every time it's mentioned, it's always that there's no proof of this. There are some books that will state that she absolutely did support their efforts through her teaching, and others that say that's not quite the case. What's your take on that?
The question is about Catherine Wright, Wilbur and Orville Wright's younger sister. Kate was 3 years younger to the day than Orville Wright. She and Orville shared a birthday. And she really was, in a sense, the third member of that team. Everybody, and they themselves, talked about how close they were, Wilbur and Orville. in fact, the two who were really close were Orville and Catherine, who were closest in age. When they were young, Wilbur tended to connect to his older brothers, Ruslan and Lauren, belonged to the same clubs they did, and so on and so forth. Orville was almost 4 years younger than Wilbur. They were separated by the birth of twins who died in infancy. And in fact, when they were growing up, Orville and Kate were the two who were closest. And the warmest, sort of most wonderful, all of the members of the Wright family were extraordinarily articulate people. But my favorite correspondence of all in that family are the letters that passed between Orville and Kate when Orville's at Kitty Hawk in 1900, 1901, 1902, and 1903. As you suggest, the question always is, what did Catherine do to help her two brothers? Just the other day, somebody else came to me who said, did she really do the algebra for them? And the truth is, no, she didn't. And she didn't contribute money to the project. It cost them roughly $1,000 to invent the airplane from the time they entered the field in 1898 until December 17, 1903, when they flew under power for the first time. And every red cent of it came from the earnings of the bicycle shop. And they didn't need Kate to teach them higher mathematics. Her real contribution, though, was really extraordinarily important. I'm not at all sure that without her they would have done it. Because when you look at Wilbur and Orville Wright, what you see are two guys. They're not married. They're living in their father's house, which their teacher, or their sister, who was fully employed as a high school teacher, she's the only college graduate in that generation of the family, is managing for them. I mean, she's watching over the household help, making sure dinner's on the table and beds are made, and she absolutely holds that home together at a time when her father is engaged in all sorts of church shenanigans and is never home. You're looking at two guys who have nothing to do but run their bicycle shop and pursue their hobby. Wouldn't that be nice? And that's the world they had. And they knew how important she was to making that possible for them. And so when Orville finally went to Europe in 1908 after his accident at Fort Myer, Catherine had come from Dayton and nursed him in the hospital here in Washington, and then the two of them went to Europe to connect with Wilbur, who would, of course, by this time become world famous for having made their first flights in public. And I've always thought it was really fitting that when they do burst on the world scene as among the first great celebrities of the new century, Catherine is right there with them, and people notice and admire her quite as much as they do Wilbur and Orville.
The only other thing with that, too, and I guess it goes to your point of how important she was the fact that she basically gave up her own personal life.
Ultimately, she did.
And didn't marry till her 50s and didn't live too long after that. And then is it true that Orville just never forgave her for that?
Yeah. This question relates to sort of Orville's relationship to Catherine in later years. When Orville had his accident at Fort Myer in September of 1908 rather, the fellow he was with, the Army officer he was with, died. He became the first person ever killed in a powered airplane accident, Tom Selfridge. And Orville was so badly injured that he would sort of carry the pain with him for the rest of his life in terms of his back pain and so on. Kate quit at that point teaching, came to Washington to be with Orville, and then went to Europe with him and never looked back. She spent the rest of her life basically supporting them. Their father dies in 1917. Wilbur died in 1912 of typhoid fever. And so Catherine and Orville are together, really, until Catherine's death in the 1920s. And you're right, of course, in her 50s, she finally did marry the editor of the Kansas City Star. And at that point, Orville does sort of turn his back on her. They have sort of a genuine break there. And it's not that hard to understand, I think. They were a married couple in every sense but the physical sense. I mean, in terms of emotional support and all of that. And I think Orville simply sort of felt stabbed in the back, that kind of thing. Not necessarily for good reasons, certainly, but I think that sort of explains his reaction. She died 2 years later, and he went to St. Louis and was with her at the end, brought the body back, and had her buried in the family plot, where he's buried now as well, with their parents and with Wilbur. And in fact, her husband remained a member of the family circle as long as there was a family circle until Orville's death. So, yes, Ellis.
Two questions. What relationship, if any, between Goddard and the American Rocket Society, and what relationship between Hunsaker as a member of NACA and the
ARS? Ellis Yokelson asks a question about Robert Hutching Goddard's relationship to the members of the American Rocket Society, and it was very interesting. Goddard, of course, had built and flown the world's first liquid propellant rocket on March 16, 1926, at a relative, his Aunt Effie Ward's house in Worcester Township, Massachusetts. Almost in secret. Almost nobody knew about it. So, 4 years later, 1931, Ed Pendray and Lee go to Germany. And they meet Willy Ley and the members of the German Rocket Society. And they see these guys firing rockets, and they're just blown away. And they come back. And as I said, the first meeting of the ARS after they return, Pendray stands up. And he actually says, you know, those Germans are really something. I have seen the first continually burning liquid propellant rocket in action. I saw it with my own eyes. The Germans have done it. Now, where are we? They knew about Robert Goddard because in 1919, Goddard had published through the Smithsonian really quite a well-known publication called A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes, in which he mathematically demonstrated the possibility of a rocket flying into space. He explained why only a rocket would work in the vacuum of space, and he demonstrated mathematically why, that it actually could do it and how. And a little bit later, in 1928, Goddard had made the headlines again. He'd been testing, again, mostly in secret, another one of his rockets, and he'd set fire to a patch of grass, and the cops had shown up in the fire department in all of Worcester, and it made the New York Times. The fact that this college professor's rocket had gone awry and started a fire, and he'd been banned from launching any more rockets in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and it made the papers. And the ARS guys, who were always looking for that stuff, they'd seen that article, but it wasn't clear exactly what Goddard had done. So Pendray says the Germans did it first. Goddard sends them a letter really quickly saying, you know, you're wrong about that. I launched a continually burning liquid propellant rocket before the Germans did. And the interesting thing is that the date that he gives for his rocket is the 1928 date, the date when he made the New York Times with the grass fire and all that. He doesn't tell them that he'd flown the first liquid propellant rocket in March of 1926. And that can only be understanding the psychology of Robert Goddard, because he's holding his real date sort of in his watch pocket. So if the rascally Germans or anybody else comes forward and says, oh, I did it before July 1928, he has his real first date hidden away. And he, every time the members of the ARS tried to draw Goddard into their meetings and their discussions, he always said no, as he did to everybody. And he, explained, gosh, this is my life work. I've invested myself and grant money, and I can't give it away to amateurs out there. At the end of his life, he finally became a member of the board of the American Rocket Society. They'd made him an honorary member years before. So I've always thought that Goddard's relationship to the ARS says a lot about Robert Goddard and his mindset and that kind of thing. Ellis's second question was about Jerry Hunsaker, who was, as he suggests, a member of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the NACA, which was the federal agency responsible for flight-related research and that kind of thing. Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia, initially, and then finally research centers elsewhere. I guess the only real relationship, Ellis, is the fact that Hunsaker was always at the cutting edge when it came to flight science and technology. He was a leader of the NACA, and he was a leader of the IAS. He was the technical editor of all IAS publications until the late 1930s, when Hugh Dryden, another NACA guy, finally took over what Jerry Hunsaker had been doing. So, I mean, in terms of both organizations, he's a fellow who represents the cutting edge of flight research.
I have a final concluding question that I know you can answer briefly. But to bring us back to collections, I know in the 60s when the new organization was created, what happened to all of those indexes and those collections and those books? I recall something about both the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian being involved. Do you want to bring us back to that briefly?
I was going to talk about that and ran out of time and plumb forgot. In the 1950s, the Institute of the Aeronautical Sciences, which has a building, the Berwyn Mansion in New York, its headquarters building, which has almost entirely become a museum and a library and an archive. The professional services that IAS is performing for its members take place out of closed closet-sized offices in that building. Almost all the building is given over to historical and research operations, historical research operations. And they finally, as Lester Gardner passes from the scene, S. Paul Johnston, who followed Lester Gardner as the executive secretary of the IAS, after struggling with it for a while, simply decides that it's just not working. The IAS is going to have to sort of marginally redefine itself, and it will no longer have anything to do with history. And at that point, it gives its historical collections away, literally, to the Smithsonian and to the Library of Congress. That's where the AIAA history collection downstairs comes from. What's down there is what's left of the historical collections, the manuscripts, and that kind of thing that Lester Gardner built in New York. The books, the objects, and that kind of thing, a lot of them went to the Smithsonian. The LC got the books that it didn't already have. So the IAS history collections do wind up in good homes.
Where did the WPA index go? Do they keep it at all?
Well, that's another story.
Briefly.
The AIAA couldn't give away all of its library because indexing was still something that made a lot of money for them. In fact, AIAA was still doing World Aerospace indices for aeronautical science and engineering publications, really from all over the world, until less than 10 years ago, when they finally lost the contract. They ultimately sold the operation to Cambridge Research, which was doing all kinds of scientific and medical indexing and could afford to fold the aerospace operation into their larger operation and make money. When they did that, everything, the library books that they had kept for the indexing operation, all of the old indexing cards and all of that went to the Linda Hall Library in Kansas City, which is a library of science and technology, basically. And it went there for a raft of strange reasons. Today, the AIAA, which for so long had such a heavy interest in history, has very little interest in history. In fact, one of the things we're trying to do, working with Lynn Bruno and folks at AIAA, is to sort of recreate an historical archive related to the history of that organization itself, which scarcely exists anymore.
Well, join me in thanking Tom for his wonderful talk and enabling us to draw Tom and his knowledge out in such a way that we've had quite a history lesson today. Thanks a lot, Tom. Please stick around if you'd like to buy the book and talk to Tom some more and have the book signed. I also am leaving flyers about the next two Center for the Book events. One is a national poetry event on Thursday afternoon with school kids and poets from D.C., where we will be giving away a new anthology, How to Eat a Poem, smorgasbord of tasty and delicious poems for young readers. And next May the 4th, we're sponsoring a talk, Did Benjamin Franklin Have a Dark Side, by Robert Middlecoff from the University of California, Berkeley, as part of our Benjamin Franklin lecture series. But please, one more time, say thank you to Tom and come and meet him.
Thank you. Sound okay?
Sound great. Oh, sure. Tom, and Lynn.
Hey, Nancy. Oh, yeah.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.